Hi, I hope you're having a really good day. My name is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. I would like to take a look again at a book by Erwin Lutzer. The book is called No Reason to Hide, subtitle Standing for Christ in a Collapsing Culture. And it's exactly what's happening today, isn't it, when we look around? Now, I've already covered part of the book. I did chapter 4 in 2 different podcasts that deals with the DEI movement, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we hear that a lot, don't we, these days? So I'm not going to deal with that chapter. I covered it, I think, pretty thoroughly. But he has a chapter here, it's his 3rd chapter, titled, Will We Expose the Greatest Lie That Is Our Nation's Most Cherished Delusion? That's quite a title. I mean, just think about that. The greatest lie that's our nation's most cherished delusion. And he has a verse from 2 Thessalonians as he gets started with the chapter. God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So there's that God sends them a strong delusion. So he starts off, quite a statement here. He says, the lie will find you. It makes its presence known in our culture's view of sexuality, psychology, education, entertainment, politics, and he says even in the teaching of some churches. And he says, what's this lie? He says it's the one that gives people permission to say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, or I'm a man trapped in a woman's body. He says it's the lie that enables people to insist 2 men having sex together can be called a marriage, turns Mother's Day into birthing people's day, because after all, men can give birth too. It leads also to the conviction that kids should be taught how to enjoy sexual pleasures, even in early grades in the schools. He says it's also the lie that's told us the idea if you don't affirm someone's strange sexuality, you're a bigot. Wow. So he says we're going to fall for this delusion that everybody possesses divinity within them, and the universal knowledge must be fanned into a flame. Well, what is this lie? Where is it? Where's it going? Well, all these talks at the beginning of the chapter, all these sentences saying this lie leads us to this, it leads us to that. So what is the lie? He said it's pretty simple. Live by your own truth and you can be whatever you want to be. He says that is the core of the rest of the issues discussed in the book. So what he's going to do in this chapter is to try to explain, where did this lie come from? And how have we seen it applied throughout history? And then he's going to single out a few famous people who've perpetuated this lie, and how actually, even though they're dead, that philosophy still rules us from their graves. And then finally, he says the most important thing he wants to do is to show how we can follow the example of someone who exposed the lie and showed us a better way. So, let's start in. Quest for Godhood, that's the next section of his book. Where did this lie come from? Well, he goes back to Genesis. So many things go back to Genesis, right? The serpent says to the woman, your eyes will be open and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. So basically, what's the serpent saying there? According to Lutzer, embrace your feelings, trust your desire for Godhood. You can become whatever you want to be. Well, there's that lie popping up really early. It's our quest for Godhood. The humanity saying that it could exchange places with the Almighty. Wow, just follow your heart and all will be well. You know, I remember, I'm going to come back to the book in just a second here, but I remember my wife and I saw a movie some time ago. It was called Rio, and it was an animated film about birds. And it was very clever and very well done. But you know what the message was? It was exactly that. Follow your heart. You just have to look deeply within yourself and choose your lifestyle and your own personal identity, and everything will work out fine. So we've heard that before. Lutzer also mentions this book, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen this book be brought up, and I've got to get a hold of it. I don't have it yet. It's by Carl Trueman, but it's spelled Trueman for the last name. Carl Trueman has a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And Trueman does the exact same thing that Lutzer is doing. He traces that lie. And it starts in Eden, and it goes through the rest of the history of the world, and now here we are. We've got it in America. It's our new religion. It's it's just permeating our politics and race and economics and our educational system, and really, really become powerful. So Letzer says, why don't we call this lie self-love or self-worship? Oh, do we see it all over the place? TV shows, to classrooms, to our jobs, even our own hearts. He says we get bombarded with all these messages. Sometimes it's verbal, sometimes the message is nonverbal, but it's to put ourselves in the driver's seat. After all, we want to be the master of our fate and the captain of our soul, as he quotes there. So he said, we're starting to see this happening all over the place. Truman wrote this: human beings may still like to think they believe in good and bad, but these concepts are unhitched from any transcendent framework and just reflect, he says, personal, emotional, and psychological preferences. Now that's powerful. Can we go over that one more time? Truman says, if you look around, people will talk good and bad terms, won't they? Oh, that's bad or that's good. But you know what? They're not basing that on any standard beyond them. In other words, if they feel it's bad, then it's bad. If they feel it's good, it's good. It's just reflecting, as he says, personal, emotional, and psychological preferences. Man, that is so bad. He says we've seen this lie happening all through history. So I'm back now to Letzer here. He says probably the person who had the greatest influence and still does today, even though he's been long dead, is Karl Marx. So Marx wanted to change the world, and he wrote a philosophy that did what? It swept God out of the way and put man in the place of God, and that changed the world forever. So he's been dead something like 140 years, but he's wanting us to be equal to the Creator. Marx didn't disbelieve in God. No, from his writings, Letzer says, you can tell he hated God. And there have been other philosophers that reversed the role of men and God, but what he did was, back to Marx here, he shifted the idea of the deity of man from an individual to the state. Now that's huge. I mean, you think about that. In America, we talk about the value of the individual. Well, Marx says, no, the deity is going to be in the state. So in 1848, Marx writes the Communist Manifesto with Frederick Engels. Discounting differences, they grouped everybody into categories. Now, we're seeing that today. We're seeing it a lot today, where it's oppressors versus the oppressed, it's women against men, it's Christians versus non-Christians, it's whites against blacks. Everybody's in a group, according to Marx here. So everybody's in categories. And they felt that there was this clash that went on between the ruling class, who controlled all the means of production. They would clash with the working group who worked on farms and in factories. And so Marx is saying you can see history as just a struggle between these two classes. And there they are, the oppressed and the oppressors. You belong to one group or the other. And Letzer says, of course, exploitation and oppression do exist. That's gone on ever since Adam and Eve's kids. You got Cain killing Abel. But here's the problem. What Marx proposed as a solution became an enslavement of the world. Why? Well, we've seen over and over, if you substitute man for God, it's always brought negative consequences. So Marx was saying, let's get rid of private property. Nobody owns anything. Everything is the property of the state. And that would end up creating a classless communist society. Well, he knew the ruling class, people that had the land, weren't going to give up that power and wealth voluntarily. You got to take it from them. So you got to have a revolution. Well, he says, take a look at how that played out in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Anybody who impeded and slowed down the development of this transformation had to be suppressed. Well, how'd they get suppressed? Well, death and suffering of millions. Many were executed just because they aligned with a different political faction there. So basically, Marx is saying you got to burn down the past before you can set up a new future. But people in power said it's going to be worth it. So standing in the way of this utopia, Marx believed, was, you ready? Religion. It was like a drug. It just kept the masses enslaved. They had these illusions that religion gave them, and that had benefited their oppressors. And for Marx, guess which the greatest oppressor was? Which religion? Christianity and the nuclear family. I mean, after all, he believed men oppressed their wives, Parents oppressed the kids. They'd take them to church. And God, up at the top, he was the ultimate oppressor. So here's what Marx says. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Now, we've heard that one before. Well, what about the family? So we're back to Carl Trueman. He says if you look at how Marx's associate, that Engels, he taught that the family turned women into chattels, just pieces of property, and you had to emancipate them, and they could become workers out in the public means of production. So mothers were seen as slaves raising their kids. They had to be liberated. They had to get out in the workforce so they could help make the state prosperous, because after all, service to the state was the highest honor. So kids would have to transfer the trust for their livelihood from their families, because you got mom and dad working. It's going to be the state that'll take care of them. And the state will distribute the wealth with equality and fairness. So again, we've got a problem. The nuclear family stands in the way of this state, and it has to be weakened, if not destroyed, so that the state can take over the authority. Well, at the bottom of this, what is Marx really thinking about the human race? Right? Good worldviews have to answer the big questions. What are humans? What's our problem? Where do we come from? How do we solve our problem? Those kinds of questions. So what did Marx believe? Human beings were essentially good. Why did they commit crimes then? Because they were oppressed. If you just got rid of these oppressors, that'd be the capitalists, everybody live in harmony and peace. It'd be wonderful. We all join hands, sing around the campfire. You got to get rid of private property. You'll have that communist utopian state, and then you won't need laws, and everybody will be content. So another belief that he had, besides the fact that we were all so good, it was that history was going toward globalism, and that eventually, great optimistically viewed here by Marx, the whole world would adopt this view of history. We had that battle cry, workers of the world unite. So he wanted a world run according to his socialist principles. This is pretty sad. He would agree with the sentiments of the World Economic Forum. Okay, maybe you've heard of them. Back in 2016, they asked members of the global future councils for their predictions of what things would be like in 2030. Well, here's the first prediction on the list. Remember, these are people who run a lot of the world economics, and they ask for predictions. What would things be like in 2030? So here's the first prediction on the list. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Let that one sink in. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Okay. Now, there are differences, he says, between Marxism and fascism, but they both agree with what Mussolini had to say. Here's what Mussolini said about fascism. Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. So what is that? Statism. The state is predominant over the individual. So Marx's goal was equality. And how do you get equality? You got to take things away from a lot of people and give it to other people. You have to have the state owning everything, and the resources could then equally be distributed. The other point about Marx, one of his underlying beliefs, was the idea that objective truth had to go away. It had to be abandoned. Why? Well, laws are set up by the ruling class to keep everybody in check. So Marx says looking for truth, he said it's whatever the state determines it to be. So whatever they decide. I mean, think about the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. What's their state newspaper called? Pravda, truth. And so it reflects the idea that no matter how distorted, the state's views are truth, right? Including the lies that are spun out of thin air. Lutzer says, go ahead, read this newspaper. You're going to have all the news you need to know. Well, the news the state wants you to know. So how does a revolution get going? Well, all the structures that we have right now in society, they've got to get torn down. So you're going to end up with chaos first. So you go from the old order to chaos, and then you get the new order. So you got to get rid of the oppressors. That'd be the capitalists or the ruling class. You got to eliminate them so the oppressed can enjoy the benefits of the Marxist state. But is a violent revolution always necessary? Is that what you need to bring about Marxism? No. Some dedicated Marxists say there's a better way, and now we come to America, Marxism in America. So how did Marxism in the first place end up in our country? Well, there's a man named Gramsci, Gramsci. He was imprisoned by Mussolini in Italy, so this is back in the 1920s, because he opposed fascism. So he started thinking, as he sat there in prison, how do I get Marxism advanced in a peaceful way, right? We don't want a bloody revolution. And he thought the way we do it is to attack the culture. And it was one activist called it the long march through the institutions. Now, what do you mean by that? Well, that Marxism could come to power without shooting everybody. You would capture the institutions like education, law, media, economics, entertainment, and things like that. So Marxism could advance slowly, step by step, institution by institution, and law by law. And people would start looking out at what was happening and say, oh, this is better. So it would come in on tiptoe, in a sense. And I just want you to think about that. Go back and look at that list. The long march through the institutions. So think about in our country today, education. Has that been changed some? Do we see anything that's putting down capitalism and replacing with the ideas of Marx? Yeah, I think so. The law, media, oh, certainly. Economics, yes. People are now being voted into power in America as socialists. What about entertainment? Yes, on and on. So he says, Marx gained influence and continues to gain influence and momentum within America. Yeah, so he's saying, I want to use the term cultural Marxism to describe a radical leftist ideology that tries to get cultural influence and institutional power. How does it do that? It vilifies our past and wants to rebuild our nation on a Marxist foundation. So what's that first step, he says? Attack culture. So back in history again. So in Germany, there's a group of Marxists known as the Frankfurt School, named after a university. And they developed what became known as critical theory or deconstruction. And what they're talking about here is that culture is seen as your enemy and you got to tear it apart. And that word deconstruction means you tear down any institution or barrier that stands in the way of this wonderful Marxist utopia. So what's the purpose of deconstruction or critical theory? Quote from somebody who buys into it, liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. So that's interesting. So they take you back, for example, to the U.S. Constitution, and they're telling you now that it doesn't really mean what it says, and that people who composed America's founding documents were white males. They had sinister motives, so you better view their documents with suspicion. We're being told that the Bible, Western laws, philosophies of the Enlightenment, don't take them as face value. They're written so certain people could hold on to power. Who? Well, specifically white people holding on to their power. And in fact, according to this new view, all of our foundational writings in America are expressions of control. They were socially constructed to keep people in their place. This whole white supremacy idea that America is intrinsically racist. Don't take the words on the page as they're written. There are evil motives there. So don't build on the past. The past has to be put down. It's got to be vilified so that cultural Marxists are free to construct a new future. So, it's the old story. You got a bad building there, a building that's been around a long time. You tear it down, you put up a new one. That's exactly what they're up to. The globalist organization called the World Economic Forum said it this way: capitalism must be reinvented and we must build back better. That sounds familiar? So critical theory, though, of course, has been applied to more than just politics. It's been applied to gender. So what are they doing with the traditional male-female binary? That's been deconstructed. Now you have to talk about more genders. We got gender theory. We got queer theory. Now we have critical race theory. And the idea is to take Christian culture especially and attack it and tear it down. All right, so this is cultural Marxism, he says. It sought institutional power. So it looks at those institutions like we talked about a few minutes ago, education and politics and entertainment and media. It takes those powers and uses them to undermine the existing order to replace it with a new future. But there's still a problem. There's still a piece missing from this puzzle. It was individual liberation from tradition, from sexual norms and restrictions, right? We've got to get people free. And because our sexual identity is viewed as really who we are as persons, that's got to be exploited. So you got to have sexual liberation added to this Marxist vision. So we're supposed to have economic freedom. We're supposed to have racial freedom. We're supposed to have female freedom. You've got to have sexual liberation. That's a big thing. So all sorts of sexual deviancy had to be normalized, Lutzer says. Well, once that happens, you start deconstructing and destroying the nuclear family. Then you get full liberation. So Marx had to merge with the teachings of Freud. So I'm going to stop at this point. There are more things in this chapter. It's a great chapter, and I hope you're starting to hear echoes of what's going on right now, thanks to Freud and thanks to the people who followed up Freud. Well, not a very cheery piece of writing, is it? Sorry about that, but we've got to be aware of what's going on these days if we're going to act as careful thinkers and interacting effectively with people. I'm just afraid that Christians in the last, let's say, 50 years have kind of abandoned the university, they've abandoned thought, they've abandoned the public square, and they just have privatized their religious beliefs. And we can't do that. We've got to argue for the better way of constructing society. And Marxism doesn't lead to a better society. We've seen that over and over again. Well, anyway, thank you for being part of this podcast, and we'll do another one soon.